is quiet now. The world outside has slowed its breathing, and here, in this gentle corner of time, we drift together toward a story that has traveled through centuries. A story whispered by oracles who claimed to speak for the gods. Imagine a parchment, weathered by hands long turned to dust, the ink faint, yet alive with voices from the ancient world. These are not the tales of a single people, nor the visions of one prophet. The Sibylline Oracles are a tapestry woven from Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian threads. A vast collection of mysterious verses that claimed to foresee the fate of empires, the rise of kings, the fall of cities, and even the end of the world itself. They were no simple poetry. They were revered, feared, and at times hidden away from the eyes of ordinary men. Their origin is cloaked in mystery, their journey across the centuries winding through temples, libraries, and even the halls of power. For rulers, they were a dangerous treasure, a guide to destiny. For common folk, they were an echo from the divine, spoken through women touched by the sacred and the strange. Tonight, I will guide you through their story, not as a scholar rushing through a textbook, but as a friend walking with you down the dimly lit streets of history, where the lamplight catches the glint of ancient words. Together, we will follow the path of the Sibylline Oracles, from their legendary beginnings in the shadowed corners of myth, to the political intrigues of Rome, to the libraries of Byzantium, and finally, to the scholars who rediscovered them in more recent centuries. This is a journey of prophecy and power, of belief and doubt, of voices that claimed to speak across the chasm of time. And while the centuries have worn away much of their certainty, they have left behind a sense of wonder and perhaps a lingering question: could any of it have been true? Before we begin, I'd love to know, from where in the world are you listening tonight? Is the sun just rising outside your window, or are you settling into the stillness of midnight? Let me know in the comments. It's always fascinating to think of how this moment is shared across so many different times and places. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. Before Rome had even dreamed of empire, before the marble temples, the Senate, and the Caesars, there were voices that spoke in riddles, carried on the wind like the scent of rain before a storm. These voices did not belong to ordinary women. They were the Sibyls, mysterious prophetesses, who seemed to belong half to this world and half to another. Their names have faded into fragments: hierophile, femino, demophile, each bound to a different place, a different shrine. And yet, no matter the land, no matter the tongue, the pattern was always the same. A woman, touched by something beyond human reach, her words both beautiful and unsettling. She spoke not in measured prose, but in the tumbling, rhythmic breath of poetry lines that seemed to come not from her own mind, but from the gods themselves. The earliest tales place one such figure in the ancient Greek city of Delphi, long before Apollo claimed the temple there. Another is said to have stood on the windswept cliffs of Earthry in Asia Minor, her hair unbound, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if watching ships no mortal could see. But among them, there is one story that flickers with particular clarity, the tale of the woman who wandered into the city of Cumae, west of Naples, in the age when kings still ruled Rome. Yet, before we reach her, we must understand the soil from which these legends grew. The ancient Mediterranean was a place where the divine seemed dangerously close at hand. Earthquakes, eclipses, storms at sea. These were not random events, but messages. The line between human and divine will was thin, and those who could interpret the signs were treated with reverence and sometimes fear. A Sibyl was unlike the priest in a temple who chanted fixed prayers or offered ritual sacrifice. She was unpredictable, wild, a living conduit for prophecy. The Greeks believed her words were inspired by Apollo, the god of light and truth, though others whispered of older deities, chthonic powers that spoke from the shadows beneath the earth. When a Sibyl spoke, her voice was sometimes calm, sometimes shaking, sometimes carried away entirely into a trance. The people listening would lean forward, trying to catch every syllable, for the gods did not waste breath on trivialities. Her prophecies were usually written down, often in riddling verse, a deliberate obscurity. The gods, it seemed, enjoyed hiding their meaning until the moment was ripe. This style would become a defining trait of the Sibylline Oracles, the mingling of poetry and enigma, so that even centuries later, scholars would argue endlessly over what the words had meant. One could travel across the Aegean, stopping at shrines and towns, and hear of different Sibyls. In the hills of Phrygia, they told of a prophetess whose voice echoed in caves. In Samos, sailors swore an ancient woman had predicted the ruin of Troy long before the first Greek ship set sail. And in the Greek colonies of Italy, the people whispered of a Sibyl whose prophecies were so precious they might shape the fate of entire kingdoms. What is striking is how the figure of the Sibyl belongs to no single city, no single people. She appears wherever the human longing to know the future meets the belief that the gods sometimes speak through chosen mouths. This universality would become important later, when her verses were no longer just local curiosities, but collected into great tomes, guarded as treasures, and even feared as weapons. It is tempting to think of the early Sibyls as solitary wanderers, women without ties to hearth or home. But some ancient accounts suggest they had attendants, scribes, or even disciples who learned their art. Perhaps they were more than mere mouthpieces. Perhaps they shaped the prophecies as they came, giving them a form that would endure beyond a single moment of inspiration. Yet the truth is slippery. The earliest references to the Sibyls in Greek literature already treat them as half-myth. Heraclitus, the philosopher, wrote in the 5th century BCE that the Sibyl, with raving mouth, utters things not to be laughed at, unadorned and unperfumed, yet they reach across 1,000 years. That line is as close as we can get to hearing an ancient man marvel at the strange authority these women held. Picture for a moment a lone traveler in the 6th century BCE. He has crossed the Ionian Sea and now stands before a small stone temple on a hill. The air is thick with the resinous scent of burning laurel leaves. Inside, a woman sits, her eyes distant, her hands resting on her knees. Without being asked, she begins to speak, a stream of words that seem at once alien and utterly personal. Perhaps she speaks of storms, or of a great king's death, or of a future harvest. Perhaps she warns of war. Whatever she says, the traveler knows it will be remembered. He will carry it back to his city, and there the prophecy will take on a life of its own, retold and reshaped, until it becomes part of the weave of local legend. The Sibylline tradition begins here, in scattered moments like these, where the veil between mortal and divine feels perilously thin. We cannot know which of these women truly lived and which were born from the imagination of poets, but their voices would travel far, far beyond the towns where they first spoke, until one day a Roman king would be offered a set of books that promised to hold the fate of his people. And that, dear listener, is where the next chapter of our journey begins, with a meeting in Cumae and an offer that could not be taken lightly. The road to Cumae wound through low, sunlit hills, scented with wild thyme and the salt breath of the sea. In the time of Rome's kings, long before the Republic's marble grandeur, Cumae was a thriving Greek settlement on the coast of Campania. Its harbor was busy with merchant ships, and its streets echoed with the mingling of Greek and Italic tongues. But beyond the markets and the chatter, there was a darker, older presence, the cave of the Sibyl. Legends say she lived deep within the earth, in a chamber carved from volcanic rock, the air inside heavy with the smell of sulfur. Daylight rarely touched those walls. Instead, the glow came from flickering lamps, their flames dancing against the stone. It was there, in the hush between the earth's heartbeats, that she received visitors, kings, warriors, envoys, each seeking answers the world could not otherwise give. One such visitor was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the 7th and final king of Rome. Proud, ambitious, and not unaccustomed to omens, Tarquin heard whispers that the Sibyl of Cumae possessed books, not scrolls of poetry or philosophy, but sacred volumes of prophecy. These were said to contain the fate of Rome itself, from its first stones to its last hour. The story, as it has come down to us, unfolds like a scene in a play. The Sibyl appeared before the king, an old woman dressed in a long, unadorned robe, her hair streaked with silver. In her hands, she carried 9 heavy books. She offered them to Tarquin for an enormous price, a sum so high it seemed absurd. The king laughed, dismissing her as a peddler of superstition. Without a word, she took 3 of the books and cast them into the fire. The parchment curled, the ink blistered, and in moments, centuries of prophecy turned to ash. When the flames died down, she turned back to the king. The price, she said, was the same. Again he refused. Again she fed the books to the fire. Now only 3 remained, and the air in the chamber had shifted. No longer the stale scent of ancient stone, but the sharp tang of something irrevocable. Tarquin, at last uneasy, asked her why she had destroyed them. The Sibyl's answer was simple. The value of the books did not diminish with their number. What remained still contained the full weight of destiny. This time, Tarquin paid the price. The 3 surviving volumes were carried back to Rome, where they would be placed in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, guarded under lock and key. Their contents, hidden from all but a select priesthood. We might dismiss this as pure legend, but there is something haunting about the image, the deliberate destruction, the king's dawning realization, the calm certainty of the Sibyl. It is a story about power, yes, but also about scarcity, about how the unknown grows more precious when pieces of it vanish forever. And so the Sibylline books, as they came to be called, entered Roman life. From that day forward, they were not to be read casually or displayed to the curious. They were a state treasure, consulted only in moments of crisis. When omens troubled the skies, when the Tiber swelled beyond its banks, when disease crept through the city like a shadow. In those moments, the guardians of the books, the duumviri, and later the decemviri, would carefully unroll the ancient pages and search for the verse that might offer Rome a path forward. What exactly was in those pages? The answer is elusive. Ancient writers suggest they contained instructions on rituals to appease the gods, warnings about disasters, and prophecies framed in the riddling poetry of the Sibyls. Some passages may have been centuries old even before Tarquin saw them. Others could have been later additions. The books were as much a mosaic as a single work. Voices from across the Mediterranean, stitched together into one ominous, sacred whole. The cave at Cumae remained a place of pilgrimage for centuries. Roman poets like Virgil imagined the Sibyl guiding heroes into the underworld, her voice echoing in the darkness. Even after the original books were lost in the Great Fire of 83 BCE, the image of that first meeting, the old woman, the fire, the king, lingered in the Roman imagination. It is easy to see why. The story is both a warning and a promise. Knowledge is costly, and the future, once glimpsed, can never be unseen. The Sibyl did not plead or bargain. She offered her price and accepted the king's refusal without emotion. She knew that in the end, he would come to her terms, not because she bent to his will, but because he would bend to hers. Some say the Sibyl of Cumae was not merely mortal, that she had lived for centuries, granted unnaturally long life by the gods, though without the gift of eternal youth. They tell of her body withering over time, shrinking until all that was left was her voice, kept in a jar, still answering questions put to her. Perhaps this was meant as a metaphor, that her body was mortal, but her words endured, echoing long after her breath had stopped. Whatever the truth, the Sibyl's meeting with Tarquin marked the beginning of Rome's long and complicated relationship with prophecy. Those 3 surviving books would shape decisions in war and peace, in religion and politics, and as we will soon see, they would be guarded more jealously than any crown jewel, for to lose them would be to lose the counsel of the gods themselves. But fate, as the Sibyl well knew, is rarely so easily kept under lock and key. The next turn in our story will take us into the marble heart of Rome itself, to the keepers of the Sibylline books, men who walked a narrow line between serving the state and serving something far older and far less predictable. The 3 books that Tarquin purchased from the Sibyl of Cumae did not sit idly on a shelf, gathering dust. From the moment they were carried through the gates of Rome, they became the most guarded writings in the city, perhaps in the entire ancient world. Their resting place was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the grand sanctuary on the Capitoline Hill that looked down upon the Forum like a watchful sentinel, built of gleaming stone, crowned with gilded terracotta. The temple was not merely a house of worship. It was the heart of Rome's relationship with the divine, the place where gods and mortals met in uneasy partnership. And in a hidden chamber, far from public view, the Sibylline books lay sealed in an iron chest. Access to them was forbidden to all but a select priesthood, originally 2 men known as the Duumviri Sacris Faciundis, chosen not for their eloquence or political ambition, but for their reliability and discretion. These men were the quiet custodians of the Republic's most potent secrets. Over time, their number grew to 10, the Decemviri, and later to 15, reflecting both the expansion of Rome's power and the increasing complexity of the omens they were called upon to interpret. Imagine for a moment the stillness of that sacred chamber. No marble grandeur here, only plain walls, the smell of old parchment, and the faint glint of the iron bindings that kept the chest shut. To open it was an act performed rarely, and never without solemn ritual. The priests would purify themselves before entering, their minds fixed on the gravity of what they were about to read. The books were not a daily guide. They were the city's final recourse when the signs of the gods grew too troubling to ignore. If lightning struck the Capitoline, if a plague emptied the streets, if the sky at midday turned the color of ash, the Senate would summon the keepers. The priests would unlock the chest, unroll the ancient verses, and search for the passage that matched the omen. The instructions found there might be specific: a sacrifice to a foreign deity, the building of a new temple, the importation of a sacred statue from distant lands. In this way, the Sibylline books became both a comfort and a source of unease. Comfort, because they offered an answer when the gods seemed angry. Unease, because those answers sometimes demanded strange and costly acts. There are records of Rome importing the worship of Sibyl, the Great Mother, because the books instructed it, of statues being brought from Greece, of foreign rites being performed in the heart of the city, rites that, under normal circumstances, would have been shunned as un-Roman. Here lay the paradox of the Sibylline books. They were kept for Rome's protection, yet their words often opened the city to the influence of distant cultures, distant gods. They reminded Rome that its destiny was tied to the wider world, whether it liked it or not. It is said the priests spoke little of what they saw within those pages. Perhaps they feared that prophecy, once set loose among the people, might cause panic or unrest, or perhaps they understood something deeper, that the future is a delicate thing, and too much knowledge of it can warp the present. In this sense, they were not merely readers, but guardians in the truest form, protectors of both the text and the city's fragile balance between faith and reason. One can imagine the tension they must have felt. These were not kings or generals, yet they held in their hands the supposed counsel of the gods themselves. Their decisions could influence the Senate, shape the mood of the people, and alter the course of Rome's history. And yet, they had no armies, no legions. Their authority came from words written, if the stories were true, by a woman who had stood centuries earlier in a cave, speaking to a king who no longer lived. From time to time, rumors leaked. A senator might hint at what the books had revealed. A priest might drop a cryptic remark over wine. These whispers were enough to keep the public imagination alive and to ensure that the books remained shrouded in awe. Even their physical appearance was a mystery to most Romans. Some pictured them as thick codices bound in gold, others as long, delicate scrolls covered in Greek hexameters. No one outside the priesthood could say for certain, but even the most sacred of guardians cannot hold back fate forever. In the year 83 BCE, disaster struck. A fire tore through the Capitoline Hill, consuming the temple of Jupiter. When the smoke cleared, the books were gone, reduced to ash. Like the 6 volumes the Sibyl herself had once burned before Tarquin's eyes. It must have been a terrible moment for the priests. The voice of the Sibyl, the guide through centuries of crisis, was silent. And yet, as Rome had done countless times before, it refused to accept defeat. The Senate ordered a search of the Mediterranean world for other Sibylline writings, fragments, copies, verses preserved in distant temples. In the years to come, messengers and scholars would cross seas and mountains to recover what they could, piecing together a new collection from the scattered remnants. But that is another chapter of our story, a chapter that begins not in the marble temples of Rome, but on the dusty roads and crowded harbors of far-off cities, where ancient words lay waiting to be found again. There are moments in Rome's history when the Senate, that austere gathering of patricians and statesmen, seemed less like a political body and more like a council of supplicants, leaning forward to hear the voice of a long-dead prophetess. The Sibylline books, kept under lock in Jupiter's temple, were never meant for casual reading. Their pages were consulted only when the city stood in the shadow of something it could neither explain nor control. An ill omen, a plague, a string of defeats in war. These were the moments when the Senate sent for the priests, the quindecimviri sacris faciundis. Picture the scene: the Senate chamber, thick with the smell of wax from guttering candles, the air heavy with the heat of too many bodies, cloaks drawn close against the winter chill. Outside, the streets hum with rumor. Something strange has been seen in the sky, a comet perhaps, or a ring of fire around the moon. Or maybe the Tiber has overflowed, carrying livestock and broken timbers through the forum. Whatever the cause, it has unsettled the people, and unrest is beginning to simmer. The priests enter quietly. They have been to the temple. They have opened the iron chest. They have unrolled the verses. The chamber falls silent. A scroll is held up, and a passage is read, perhaps in Greek, the language of prophecy, its rhythm strange to Latin ears. The words are both beautiful and unnerving, as all good prophecies are. The Senate listens, weighing every phrase. If the books say a foreign god must be honored, then a statue will be brought from afar, no matter the cost. If a ritual must be performed, the Senate will see it done, even if it means adopting practices no Roman would normally tolerate. There was precedent for this. In the Second Punic War, when Hannibal threatened the city itself, the Sibylline books advised bringing the Great Mother, Sibyl, from Pessinus in Asia Minor. The Senate obeyed, and soon the goddess's black stone was set in her Roman temple, guarded with reverence. The oracles could also be stern in their demands. In times of plague, they might instruct that games be held in honor of Apollo, the god of healing, but with strict ritual precision. In times of famine, they might command offerings to Ceres, or even to obscure deities whose names were otherwise barely spoken in Rome. The Senate might grumble in private, but the decrees of the books were carried out, for to ignore them would risk the wrath of the gods. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what this meant. In a city famed for its pragmatism, prophecy could hold political weight. The Senate, for all its worldly concerns, would yield to the words of a voice that had spoken centuries before. The Sibylline books were a bridge between the Senate's reason and the people's belief, and perhaps also a political tool, for those who controlled the interpretation of the verses could, in subtle ways, steer the will of the state. Not everyone was comfortable with this. Some feared that the priests might bend the meaning of the prophecies to suit their own purposes or the ambitions of certain senators. Others worried that foreign influence, the Greek rhythms of the poetry, the mention of distant gods, might undermine Rome's identity. Yet even these skeptics rarely argued for abandoning the books altogether. They were too deeply woven into the fabric of Roman life. In this way, the Sibylline Oracles became a kind of silent senator themselves. never seated in the chamber, never raising a hand to vote, yet shaping the direction of the Republic in moments of crisis. And the more the Senate relied on them, the more the people came to see the oracles as part of Rome's destiny. Of course, prophecy rarely offers comfort without cost. The instructions of the books could be expensive, disruptive, even humiliating. When a pestilence struck in the 4th century BCE, the oracles commanded the introduction of new religious rites. Rites so foreign that some Romans whispered the city was losing its soul. Yet the plague ended, and the people remembered that it was the Sibyl's guidance that had delivered them. Over time, this cycle repeated itself: crisis, consultation, ritual, relief. Each time it happened, the Sibylline books sank deeper into the Senate's political life. Senators might debate fiercely over grain laws or military campaigns, but when a priest entered the chamber with a scroll in hand, even the proudest voices fell quiet, and there was always the sense, faint but persistent, that the books knew more than they revealed. That somewhere in those tightly rolled scrolls were verses the priests had never dared to read aloud. Perhaps they spoke of Rome's fall, or of events so far in the future they seemed like fantasy. The Senate never asked for more than was needed, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps out of fear that too much knowledge might unmake the city. Yet fate is patient, and the power of prophecy is never fully under human control. The same books that could save the Republic could also lead it into peril, and that danger would come sooner than the Senate expected. For in the year 83 BCE, as fire swept the Capitoline Hill, the sacred chest was consumed in the flames. The Sibyl's voice was silenced for the moment, but Rome, stubborn as ever, would not let prophecy die. And so began a great search, a hunt across seas and kingdoms to gather every fragment of the Sibylline tradition still left in the world. That journey, scattered with shipwrecks, foreign temples, and the stubborn resilience of old words, is where we will go next. The winter of 83 BCE began like any other in Rome. The streets damp with rain, the hills wrapped in the low, heavy clouds that sometimes settle over the city for days. Life in the Forum went on, though the Republic itself was trembling under the weight of civil war. Rival generals, Marius and Sulla, had torn the state apart, and the air was thick with the memory of violence. It was in this fragile moment that the unthinkable happened. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, proud and ancient, stood on the Capitoline Hill like a guardian over the city. Its gold and ivory gleamed even on gray days. Pilgrims climbed its steps to offer sacrifices. Foreign dignitaries marveled at its grandeur. And deep within its most secret chamber, the Sibylline books lay in their iron chest. For centuries, they had been the last refuge of the Senate in times of crisis. But in that year, fire found its way to the hill. The accounts are blurred by time, but most agree the blaze began during the chaos of political upheaval, perhaps sparked by fighting perhaps by accident. Whatever its cause, the flames rose quickly, fed by the wooden beams that framed the temple's roof. Smoke rolled across the forum like a storm cloud, blotting out the sun. Citizens poured into the streets, shouting, pointing, some running toward the hill with buckets, others falling to their knees in prayer. Inside, the heat swelled. Gold softened. Statues cracked. The great doors warped in their hinges, and in that hidden chamber, the Sibylline books, centuries of prophecy written on fragile parchment, began to curl and blacken. The ink that had once danced in Greek hexameter blistered and vanished. No human hand could stop it. By the time the flames were beaten back, the temple was a skeleton of charred stone. The chest was gone. The books were gone. The voice of the Sibyl, the guide of generations, had been reduced to ash. The loss was not merely religious, it was political. Without the books, the Senate had no sanctioned way to interpret the will of the gods in moments of peril. And the timing could not have been worse. Rome was still unstable, and omens, real or imagined, carried tremendous weight. Whispers began to spread. Had the gods abandoned the city? Or was this a punishment for the corruption and bloodshed of recent years? The Senate's reaction was swift. They would not let the Sibylline tradition die. Orders were sent out across the Mediterranean, carried by messengers and envoys to every corner of Rome's vast network of allies and subject states. Their mission was clear: search for any and all Sibylline verses that might still exist, whether in temples, libraries, or the hands of private collectors. It was no easy task. The Sibylline tradition was scattered, fragmented. The original books had been a collection of prophecies gathered over centuries from multiple Sibyls, Greek, Anatolian, perhaps even Levantan in origin. Now the priests had to seek those fragments again, piecing together a mosaic from shards of poetry, some genuine, others forged. The search became a kind of sacred scavenger hunt. In Erythri, a coastal city in Asia Minor, priests claimed to have scrolls written by their local Sibyl. In Ilium, on the plains where Troy once stood, fragments of prophecy were said to be carved into wooden tablets. In Samos, in Jergis, in Africa, in Sicily, the envoys knocked on the doors of temples, bargained with reluctant keepers, and copied down whatever verses they were allowed to see. The danger, of course, was authenticity. How could they know which prophecies truly came from the Sibylline tradition, and which had been written by clever hands hoping for Roman gold? Some verses were so obscure they could have meant anything. Others were suspiciously flattering to local rulers, as if written to curry favor. Still, the Senate gathered them all, preferring to err on the side of inclusion. By the time the search ended, the priests had assembled a new collection, sealed once more in the temple of Jupiter after its rebuilding. But even in their restored form, the books were not quite the same. The voice within them had changed. No longer the singular, mysterious chorus preserved since Tarquin's day, but a patchwork of voices stitched together from across the Mediterranean. And perhaps this was fitting. Rome itself was no longer the small kingdom that had once purchased those first 3 volumes from the Sibyl's hand. It had grown into a power that touched every shore of the known world. Its prophecies, too, would now speak with many tongues, yet there was a shadow beneath the triumph of their recovery. For the more people handled the books, the more chances there were for human ambition to meddle in their meaning. The purity of the Sibylline voice, if such a thing had ever truly existed, was now vulnerable to the interpretations and the politics of the men who kept them. Still, for the Romans, having the books in any form was better than silence. They had felt the void of their absence, and they would not let that happen again, at least, not willingly. But history has a way of testing even the most careful guardians. And in the next part of our journey, we will follow those recovered verses and the men who carried them as they travel far beyond Rome into the lands and temples from which they had come, and into the hearts of people who would shape them in ways the original Sibyl might never have imagined. The fire that consumed the temple of Jupiter in 83 BCE had left more than smoke and rubble behind. It had left an emptiness, a silence where the Sibyl's voice had once been. The Senate could not allow that silence to linger. The books had been more than sacred relics. They had been Rome's compass in storm and shadow. Without them, the city's spiritual bearings felt dangerously adrift. And so began one of the most extraordinary hunts of the ancient world, a mission not for treasure or conquest, but for words. The Senate dispatched envoys, not soldiers. These were learned men, priests and scribes, men accustomed to the delicate work of negotiation rather than the clang of sword and shield. Each was given authority to travel anywhere Rome's influence reached, and even beyond it, in search of Sibylline verses. Their instructions were simple in statement, but vast in scope. Seek every prophecy spoken by a Sibyl, wherever it may be found. The road from Rome to the far edges of the Mediterranean was long and winding. The first steps took the envoys across the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Greek colonies of southern Italy, where old temples clung to hillsides, and the names of local Sibyls still lingered in memory. In Cumae itself, they searched for anything the old prophetess might have left behind: inscriptions, copied verses, even fragments half remembered by the temple priests. From there, the search widened to Ur-3 in Asia Minor, where a Sibyl had once been said to speak with the wind from the sea. They carried Roman seals and letters of introduction. The priests there showed them scrolls they claimed were the work of their Sibyl, hierophile verses etched in Greek hexameter, their edges crumbling. The Romans took copies, careful not to demand the originals, lest they offend the local gods. In Ilium, the city that claimed descent from the heroes of Troy, they found a small temple said to have preserved wooden tablets carved with prophecy. Whether these were truly Sibylline or not, no one could say, but the Romans wrote them down all the same. In Samos, they heard of an aged priest who claimed to know a prophecy that foretold Rome's greatness. A verse suspiciously flattering to Roman pride. Still, it was copied. The searchers knew the Senate would rather sort through too much than too little. Not all encounters were so cooperative. In some places, the locals were reluctant to part with their oracles, fearing that to give away the words would rob their city of its divine protection. In others, they demanded gifts, gold, fine cloth, Roman citizenship, before opening their archives. The envoys carried small chests of such offerings, understanding that prophecy, though priceless, often had a very real cost. The search went beyond Greek lands. In North Africa, along the coast once ruled by Carthage, there were whispers of Sibylline fragments carried by traders from the east. In Sicily, verses had been carved into stone as part of public monuments. In Rhodes, a librarian claimed to have compiled Sibylline prophecies into a single codex, though its authenticity was questioned even then. And then there was the matter of forgeries. News of Rome's quest spread quickly, and where there is demand, supply, genuine or false, will appear. Some verses brought back to Rome were clearly the work of clever poets, dressed in the rhythm of prophecy, but steeped in political flattery. Others may have been local prophecies, altered to insert Rome into the narrative. But the Senate had instructed the envoys to be thorough. Better to bring home 100 doubtful lines than risk leaving behind a single true one. Months turned into years. Ships were lost to storms. Scrolls were damaged by sea spray. Messengers vanished on roads where bandits waited for travelers rich with gold and parchment. But piece by piece, the fragments accumulated. When the envoys returned to Rome, they carried their cargo not in wagons, but in sealed chests, bundles of papyrus and parchment, tablets of wood and wax, even inscriptions copied onto thin sheets of lead. These were taken to the rebuilt temple of Jupiter, where the quindecimviri began the long work of sorting, comparing, and compiling. It must have been a strange and delicate process, deciding which voices would be allowed to speak again in the new Sibylline books. Imagine the priests at their desks, unrolling a scroll from Earthry beside one from Africa, reading aloud to hear the cadence of the lines, debating whether a prophecy's tone felt authentic. No single Sibyl's voice emerged. Instead, the books became a chorus of many, stitched together into one whole. In this way, the Sibylline tradition survived, altered, perhaps diluted, but alive. The new books were once again sealed away, their verses to be heard only when the Senate faced omens too grave to ignore. The people of Rome would never see them, but they knew the voice of the Sibyl had returned to the city, and that was enough. Yet, even now, there were those who wondered, in gathering so many voices, had the Romans preserved the Sibyl's wisdom, or had they drowned it in a sea of borrowed words? The books would speak again, in times of plague, in times of war and in times when the fate of the city hung by a thread. But the certainty that had once surrounded them was gone. The next part of our journey takes us beyond Rome's walls, into the growing influence of the Sibylline tradition outside the city. In lands where Jewish and Christian writers would begin to weave their own visions into this ancient prophetic fabric, reshaping it for new faiths and new futures. By the time the Sibylline books were restored in Rome after the fire, the world beyond the city's walls was already changing. The Mediterranean was no longer just a patchwork of Greek colonies, Punic ports, and Roman provinces. It was a vast, interconnected stage where cultures met, clashed, and quietly borrowed from one another. The Sibylline tradition, once the guarded property of Rome's priests, began to find echoes in other lands, in other tongues, and as it traveled, it changed. Among the Jewish communities scattered across the Hellenistic world, there were those who saw in the Sibyl's voice an opportunity. The Jewish people had their own prophetic heritage, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel voices that spoke not of Apollo or Jupiter, but of the God of Israel. Yet in the Greek-speaking cities where Jews lived alongside pagans, there was a delicate balance to maintain. The Sibyl's form, her hexameter verses, her air of divine mystery, was familiar to the Gentiles. To speak through her was to speak in a language the wider world would understand. So, sometime around the 2nd century BCE, Jewish writers began to compose their own Sibylline oracles. These were not for the Roman temple, nor meant to be hidden away in chests. They were written for public reading, blending the style of Greek prophecy with the moral vision of the Hebrew scriptures. In these verses, the Sibyl no longer praised the gods of Olympus. Instead, she spoke of the one true God, denounced idolatry, and foretold the judgment that would come upon those who worshipped false deities. It was a bold adaptation, almost a literary disguise. By putting their own beliefs into the mouth of the Sibyl, Jewish authors gave their message a familiar face, while at the same time challenging the spiritual foundations of the pagan world. And then, in the first centuries of our era, the Christians took up the same thread. The early followers of Jesus lived in a world saturated with prophecy. Roman augurs watched the flight of birds. Greek oracles still murmured in their sacred groves. The Sibylline books in Jupiter's temple were consulted in moments of state crisis. To preach the gospel in such a world meant engaging with that prophetic expectation, and, in some cases, reshaping it. Christian writers began to claim that the Sibyl, like the Hebrew prophets, had foretold the coming of Christ. In the Christian Sibylline Oracles, which survive in later compilations, the ancient prophetess speaks of a king sent by God, of a time when swords would be broken, and of a final judgment when the righteous would be rewarded and the wicked cast down. These verses, cast in the old hexameter form, were presented as if they had come from the deep well of antiquity, untouched by the new faith's own hand. Of course, the reality was different. Much of this material was freshly composed, drawing on both Jewish and Christian scriptures, and then dressed in the voice of the Sibyl. Yet this did not necessarily diminish its power. To a listener in the Roman world, the Sibyl was an ancient authority, older than the empire itself. If she had spoken of the Christian hope, then that hope could not be dismissed as a recent invention. In this way, the Sibyl's voice became a bridge, not just between cultures, but between religions. She could speak in the port of Alexandria, where Jewish merchants debated with Greek philosophers, in the marketplaces of Antioch, where Romans, Syrians, and Persians crossed paths, and even in the halls of learned bishops, where her verses were copied alongside the works of the church fathers. But with this widening came a loss of control. No longer confined to a locked chest on the Capitoline, the Sibylline tradition began to branch and multiply. The oracles that Rome's priests consulted during omens were not the same as those recited in synagogues or churches. In some verses, the Sibyl praised the God of Israel. In others, she hailed Christ. In still others, she remained loyal to Apollo. To read them all together was to hear a chorus of overlapping voices, each reshaping the figure of the Sibyl to suit their own vision of the world's destiny. And yet, perhaps this was inevitable. The Sibyl had always been a wanderer, appearing in one city, then another, never wholly belonging to a single people. Her voice was like a river, flowing through many lands, taking on the color of the soil it touched. For some, this universality was the proof of her truth. If every nation could hear the Sibyl speak in its own tongue, then perhaps she was indeed the voice of a higher power. For others, it was cause for suspicion. How could one woman, real or imagined, serve so many masters and still be believed? In the centuries to come, this adaptability would ensure the Sibylline tradition's survival, even as the empire itself began to fade. But it would also invite new themes into her verses, themes that would turn her gaze from the fates of individual cities to the fate of the entire world. And so, as the Mediterranean world shifted toward new faiths and new empires, the Sibyl's voice began to speak more and more of the end of cataclysm, judgment, and the final renewal of all things. That is where our path leads next. Into the age when the Sibylline Oracles took an apocalyptic turn, their verses heavy with the weight of the world's last days. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries of our era, the Sibyl's voice had traveled far from the marble steps of Jupiter's temple. She had spoken in the marketplaces of Alexandria, in the libraries of Antioch, in the quiet corners of Jewish synagogues, and the candlelit rooms of early Christian gatherings. And somewhere along that long journey, her words began to darken. In the oldest Sibylline verses, whether pagan or adapted, prophecy had often been practical, warnings of plague, famine, or foreign invasion, given so that people might avert disaster through sacrifice or repentance. But now, a different note began to sound. It was not the fate of a single city or empire that the Sibyl foresaw, but the fate of the whole world. These newer oracles spoke in the language of endings. They told of fire consuming the earth, of seas boiling, of stars falling from the heavens like ripe fruit shaken from a tree. Empires, whether Roman, Persian, or imagined, would crumble into dust. No safe harbor would remain, no altar untouched by judgment. The world itself was a stage on which the final act was already being rehearsed. Why this shift? Perhaps it was the age itself. The great unity of the Mediterranean under Rome was showing its cracks. Civil wars had shaken the empire. The frontiers were restless. The once clear borders between civilization and barbarian seemed to blur. Earthquakes, floods, and plagues struck with terrifying force. To those who lived through these years, it was not hard to imagine that the earth was in its last days. For Jewish and Christian writers especially, this apocalyptic note was not unfamiliar. The Hebrew prophets had spoken of a day of the Lord when all would be judged. The book of Daniel had painted visions of beasts, kingdoms, and a final triumph of God's people. And in the Christian tradition, the revelation of John had already set down images of trumpets, bowls, and the descent of a new heaven and new earth. What was remarkable was the way the Sibyl's voice could be woven into this tapestry. In the Christian Sibylline Oracles, she became almost a sister to John of Patmos, her hexameter verses echoing his visions. She too spoke of a final king who would come in righteousness. She too described the world's last battle, the destruction of idols, the resurrection of the dead. In some versions, she even foretold the virgin birth, a striking claim that bound her directly to the story of Christ. These were not whispers kept behind temple doors. The apocalyptic Sibyl spoke in public, her verses recited or read aloud, often as a warning. To pagans, she could be presented as the ancient voice of the earth itself, foretelling the downfall of the corrupt. To Christians, she was proof that even the pagan world's own prophetess had seen the truth of the gospel. But the apocalyptic turn was more than a theological tool. It also gave the Sibylline tradition a strange kind of immortality. Predictions of specific events may be proven wrong or forgotten, but predictions of the end, especially when couched in cosmic imagery, remain ever on the horizon. The world's troubles can always be read as the signs she foretold. A famine here, a war there, a great city falling to fire. All could be woven back into her verses as proof that the end was near. One can almost picture the scene in a dimly lit room. A reader unrolling a scroll, his voice slow and solemn, while those gathered lean forward, their shadows long against the walls. Outside, a storm may be breaking over the rooftops, the wind rattling the shutters. Inside, the Sibyl speaks of mountains melting, of the earth splitting, of the righteous taken to safety, while the wicked are swept away. Whether they believed every word or not, Those who listened would remember the feeling, the weight of inevitability, the sense that history itself was a river rushing toward a single, thunderous waterfall. And yet, for all its darkness, the Sibyl's apocalyptic voice was not without hope. In many of these later oracles, the destruction of the world was followed by renewal, a golden age, a new kingdom, a time when justice would reign. For Jewish writers, this was the reign of the Messiah. For Christians, it was the return of Christ. For others, perhaps it was simply the dream of a world set right again. The fire that consumed the old would be the fire that purified the earth for the new. It is here that we can see the enduring allure of the Sibyl. She did not merely speak of endings, but of what might come after. She was not a prophet of despair, but of transformation. In her visions, the destruction of empires and cities was not an empty tragedy, but the necessary breaking of a shell so that something greater might emerge. Still, her words carried an unmistakable urgency. They demanded to be heard, to be weighed, to be pondered. And in the centuries to come, they would be copied into manuscripts, preserved in monasteries, and even quoted by Christian emperors as proof of divine providence. But before the Sibyl could become a medieval figure, before her voice would echo through the halls of Gothic cathedrals, she still had a role to play in the shifting religious landscape of the late Roman world, a role that would bind her not just to the ancient gods and the new faith, but to the very political struggles of the empire itself. That is where we turn next, to the Sibyl in the service of emperors, bishops, and the great debates that shaped the last centuries of Rome. By the 4th century of our era, the Roman world was no longer the unshakable colossus it had once been. The old gods still had their temples, but their statues stood in the shadow of something new. The rising cross of Christianity. The empire's heart still beat in Rome and Constantinople, yet the sound was different, slower, more uncertain, as if the great body sensed its own age. It was in this shifting world that the Sibyl's voice was called upon once more, not just as a whisper from the past, but as a tool in the present. For centuries, Rome's rulers had consulted prophecy when the state trembled. Now, emperors and bishops alike saw in the Sibyl's verses a way to claim the mantle of destiny. If her words could be shown to predict the triumph of their cause, whether pagan or Christian, then that cause could be framed as part of the cosmic order itself. Among the most striking examples is the way Christian leaders embraced her. By the time of Constantine, the Sibyl had been woven into the tapestry of Christian apologetics. In public debates with pagan philosophers, bishops might quote her lines foretelling a king sent by the Most High, or describing a virgin who would bear a child destined to rule the nations. To a mixed audience, this was powerful. It was not a Christian scripture being quoted, but a voice from the ancient pagan world itself, pointing toward the gospel. Constantine's own reign, a bridge between pagan Rome and the Christian empire, seemed almost made for such prophetic framing. His victory at the Milvian Bridge, his vision of the cross, his unification of the empire under a new faith, all could be presented as the fulfillment of destiny. In the hands of imperial propagandists, the Sibyl became part of that story, her verses brought forward as if she had spoken of Constantine centuries before. Yet the old religion was not silent. Pagan intellectuals, too, claimed the Sibyl as their own. They argued that her earliest prophecies spoke of the eternal gods, that her voice belonged to the temples, not the churches. For them, the Christian appropriation of the Sibyl was an act of theft, or worse, of deliberate distortion. Thus, the Sibyl became not only a bridge between cultures, but also a battleground. Her words could be bent, adapted, reinterpreted. Each side accused the other of twisting her meaning, of erasing inconvenient verses and inventing new ones. And in truth, both sides did. The Sibylline tradition had never been static. It was a living body of text, growing and changing with each hand that copied it. In the quieter corners of the empire, far from the court, her verses continued to circulate in less formal ways. A traveling storyteller might recite them in a market square, his voice lowering when he spoke of the end of days. A monk in a distant monastery might find them tucked between psalms and gospels in a worn codex. A philosopher might quote her in a lecture on the fate of the soul, treating her as one voice among many in the ancient chorus. What made her so enduring in these years was not merely the content of her prophecies, but the air of antiquity that clung to them in a world where legitimacy often depended on age, where the oldest traditions were seen as the most trustworthy. The Sibyl's supposed roots in the distant, pre-Roman past gave her unmatched weight. Even those who doubted her authenticity often felt the need to address her, as if ignoring her entirely would be a dangerous omission. By the late empire, she had become a kind of shared inheritance. Pagans claimed her as a prophetess of Apollo, Christians as a witness to Christ, and some simply as a poet of cosmic truth. In this way, she mirrored the empire itself, vast, diverse, often contradictory, yet still held together, for a time, by a shared frame. And as the political world grew more unstable, prophecy gained renewed importance. The invasions that shook the frontiers, the civil wars that tore at the provinces, the strange omens reported in the skies, all could be read as signs the Sibyl had long foretold. For the anxious citizen, hearing her verses was both a confirmation of fear and, oddly, a comfort. If she had foreseen these things, then perhaps they were not random chaos, but part of a story whose ending was already written. But that ending was approaching. Soon, the Western Empire would stand at the edge of collapse. The Sibyl's voice, though, would not vanish with it. She would follow the currents of history into the medieval world, her identity reshaped yet again, her verses copied by scribes who had never seen a Roman forum. Before that, however, she would undergo one more transformation, one that would carry her from the hands of the empire's elite into the illuminated margins of Christian manuscripts, where she would stand alongside kings, saints, and angels. That is where our path leads next, into the monastic scriptoria of the early Middle Ages, where the Sibyl's words would take on a new life among parchment, ink, and gold leaf. When the political weight of Rome crumbled in the West, much else fell with it: the great libraries, the grand schools, the marble temples open to the sky. Yet not everything was lost. In the quiet hum of monasteries scattered across Europe, the slow work of preservation began. It is easy to picture the scene: a stone-walled scriptorium, narrow windows letting in only the palest shafts of daylight. A monk bends over a sheet of vellum, the smell of ink and scraped parchment thick in the air. Around him, the steady sound of quills scratching, a rhythm almost like rain on wood. It is here, in these remote sanctuaries, that the Sibyl found her next home. The monastic keepers did not inherit her directly from the marble steps of ancient temples. They received her voice through the tattered manuscripts that had survived the turbulence of late antiquity. Sometimes whole, sometimes fragmentary, sometimes woven into other works entirely, the Sibylline Oracles were copied into codices alongside psalms, biblical commentaries, and the lives of saints. To the monks, she was no longer the servant of Apollo. She was a pagan witness to Christ, an ancient voice that they believed had long foretold his coming. The medieval mind was drawn to patterns, to the way events could be linked across centuries as signs of divine order. In the Sibyl's verses, the monks saw confirmation that their faith stretched back beyond Bethlehem, beyond Moses, even into the mysterious world before the flood. Her antiquity gave her authority. She was a voice from the very edge of human memory. Peering forward to the moment they considered the turning point of all history. Some scriptoria treated her with almost as much reverence as the biblical prophets. Her lines were carefully copied, the Latin translations set out in neat columns, sometimes framed with ornament. In certain illuminated manuscripts, her image appeared a robed woman, often holding a scroll, her gaze distant as though she were still seeing what others could not. These were not pagan idols, but sanctified witnesses, their words now safely within the keeping of the church. But the medieval Sibyl was not a mere ornament. Her verses still carried power. Preachers could quote her in sermons to impress upon their congregations that even the ancients outside Israel had glimpsed the truth. Scholars, writing vast commentaries, would place her alongside the Psalms and the prophets as part of a continuous testimony. The church did not forget that her origin was outside their canon, yet they found that very fact useful. She stood as proof that God's signs had been sown everywhere, even in the world of the pagans. This, of course, was a selective memory. The monks did not copy every Sibylline verse they found. Those that spoke too openly of Apollo or praised the gods of Olympus were quietly set aside. Others were subtly altered in translation, reshaped to align more closely with Christian doctrine. In this way, the medieval Sibyl was not just preserved, she was remade. And still, something of her older voice lingered. Even in her Christianized form, she carried that strange, wandering quality, as though her feet had never been bound to one temple or one altar. She had walked from the groves of Cumae to the steps of the Capitol, from the lecture halls of Alexandria to the courts of emperors. And now she moved quietly among candle flames and wooden desks, her voice threaded into the rhythm of the church's liturgical year. Her apocalyptic tone, so strong in late antiquity, found new resonance in the medieval world. The fear of the world's end was never far from the minds of monks, peasants, or kings. Wars, plagues, and strange celestial signs could be read as proof that the end was near. The Sibyl's prophecies, copied anew by each generation, gave those fears a kind of narrative. They were not senseless misfortunes, but steps toward a divinely ordained conclusion. Yet her message was not only of doom. The renewal she promised after the final fire, the age of justice and peace, fit perfectly into the Christian hope for the kingdom of God. This is perhaps why the medieval church held her so close. She spoke the language of judgment, but also of redemption. In her verses, the monks found both warning and comfort. It is worth imagining what the monk at his desk might have felt as he shaped each letter. Perhaps he had never left the valley where the monastery stood, never seen the ruins of Rome, never heard the bustle of a great city, and yet, through the Sibyl's words, he was connected to that immense and ancient world. He was preserving a voice that had spoken to emperors and crowds, to philosophers and soldiers, and now, through him, would speak again to generations yet unborn. This was the great irony of the Sibylline tradition. It had begun in the living, breathing world of public prophecy, meant for immediate action. And now it was being sealed into books for quiet contemplation. But this sealing did not kill it. The Sibyl, in her strange way, had adapted once more. And from these monastic walls, she would find new paths outward. In time, her voice would not only echo in manuscripts, but also in art, in cathedrals, in the great poetry of the Renaissance. The monks were not her final keepers. They were her bridge into a new flowering of culture. Before that, though, we must follow her into the centuries when her image began to appear not just in books, but carved in stone and painted in color for all to see. When the Sibyl would step once again into the public eye, her prophecy no longer confined to parchment. The flickering light of candles is not the only place the Sibyl's voice could be found in the medieval world. Beyond the quiet walls of monasteries, her image and words began to take shape in the very stones and colors of Europe's great cathedrals. Imagine walking through a vast Gothic cathedral, the air cool and still, the soaring arches stretching toward the heavens. Your eyes are drawn upward, where painted figures gaze down from high above the nave, saints, angels, and among them, an unexpected presence, a woman robed not in the finery of royalty, but in humble garments, holding a scroll or a book, her eyes fixed on some unseen vision. This is the Sibyl. Her appearance in Christian art might seem surprising at first. How did a pagan prophetess, born of Greek myth and pagan ritual, come to be honored alongside the apostles and martyrs? The answer lies in the deep medieval belief that truth could be found, even in pagan wisdom, if it pointed toward the Christian mystery. The Sibyl was no mere relic of a forgotten past. She was a symbol of God's revelation, reaching beyond the boundaries of any one faith. Her image adorned the portals of cathedrals, the vaulted ceilings, the stained glass windows glowing with light. In these sacred spaces, the Sibyl stood as a bridge between the ancient world and the Christian present, between prophecy and fulfillment, between mystery and revelation. One of the most famous examples is found in the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo painted not only the prophets of Israel, but also the classical Sibyls, each depicted with intense, contemplative faces, their gestures frozen in moments of divine inspiration. These Sibyls, surrounded by swirling drapery and monumental architecture, embody the weight of centuries of belief and artistic devotion. Yet, this blending of pagan and Christian was not merely decorative. The Sibyl's presence in art reflected a medieval theology that saw the ancient world as a kind of prelude to the gospel. Just as the Hebrew prophets had foretold the coming of Christ, so too had these women from distant lands and older religions. Their voices, preserved in texts and images, reminded worshippers that God's plan was universal, reaching even the forgotten corners of pagan antiquity. The scrolls the Sibyls held often bore cryptic inscriptions, fragments of prophecy in Latin or Greek. These words were carefully chosen by the artists and theologians of the time, sometimes lifted from the Sibylline Oracles, sometimes adapted to fit the theological themes of judgment, salvation, or divine wisdom. To a medieval viewer, these images were not just beautiful, they were teachings, visual sermons carved and painted in stone and glass. Beyond the grand cathedrals, the Sibyl appeared in smaller chapels and manuscripts, her figure repeated in a variety of forms. Sometimes she was shown alone, gazing upward in silent vision. Sometimes she was part of a grand narrative cycle, her prophecy unfolding alongside scenes from the Old and New Testaments. This ubiquity reveals something profound about the place of prophecy in medieval spirituality. The Sibyl, like the prophets, was a reminder that the world was charged with meaning, that history was not random but directed, and that human beings stood on the edge of divine mystery. Yet the Sibyl's image also carried a subtle tension. She was a figure from the pagan past, yet embraced by the Christian present. Her words, sometimes ambiguous or even dark, invited reflection and interpretation. Was she a true prophet or a poetic symbol? A voice of divine truth or a shadow of older myths? The medieval mind often held these questions in balance, valuing the Sibyl for the mystery she embodied rather than for clear answers. As centuries passed, the Sibyl's images became part of the very fabric of European culture. Pilgrims, kings, and common folk would see her gaze as they entered sacred spaces, a silent reminder of the depths beneath history's surface. Her presence in art reinforced the idea that prophecy, the glimpse beyond time, was a gift and a challenge. And as the Renaissance dawned, artists and scholars would rediscover her once again, weaving her stories into new works, interpreting her verses with fresh eyes. But that, as we shall see, is another chapter in the long, winding history of the Sibylline Oracles, a story that stretches from ancient groves to modern dreams. For now, we leave the echo of footsteps in stone halls and the glow of stained glass, carrying with us the knowledge that prophecy, like art, is a light cast forward through the ages. The dawn of the Renaissance was a time when the past and the present entwined in a delicate dance. The rediscovery of ancient texts, the revival of classical learning, and the flourishing of art all brought the Sibyl back into sharp focus, no longer confined to monastic scriptoria or cathedral walls alone. She became a symbol of humanity's yearning to reconnect with forgotten wisdom, a bridge between the ancient world and the new spirit of inquiry blossoming across Europe. Scholars began to seek out the Sibylline Oracles with renewed curiosity. Manuscripts, once carefully hidden away, were studied and translated with passion. The Sibyl was no longer merely a figure of religious prophecy, but a poetic and philosophical voice whose verses spoke to questions of fate, divine will, and the nature of time. Humanists admired her as a part of the classical heritage, a woman whose prophecies held echoes of both pagan mystery and Christian fulfillment. Artists, too, found inspiration in her enigmatic figure. Michelangelo's Sibyls in the Sistine Chapel stand as towering monuments to this Renaissance revival. Each Sibyl is depicted with striking individuality, fierce, contemplative, powerful. They embody not just prophecy, but the very essence of creative genius, a symbol of humanity's striving to grasp the divine. In these painted faces, the Sibyl is reborn as a muse of both art and knowledge. But the Renaissance Sibyl was not without her contradictions. As Europe explored new worlds and new ideas, the Sibyl's prophecies were sometimes treated less as sacred oracles and more as intriguing relics of an older worldview. Writers debated her authenticity, her origins, even her relevance. Yet her allure remained undeniable, her voice a haunting reminder of mystery at the edge of reason. This period also saw the Sibyl's words used in a variety of new contexts, from political propaganda to theological debate. Monarchs and church leaders alike invoked her prophecies to legitimize their rule or their faith. Much as emperors had done centuries before, the Sibyl had become, in a sense, a versatile symbol, adaptable to the changing currents of power and belief. As printing presses spread across Europe, the Sibylline texts reached wider audiences. Her voice, once the preserve of learned monks and courtiers, could now be heard in the homes of curious readers and the halls of new universities. This accessibility transformed her from a distant figure of myth into a participant in the ongoing conversation about fate, history, and human destiny. Yet for all this renewed interest, the Sibyl's mysteries remained intact. Scholars debated which texts were genuinely ancient and which were later additions. The prophecies themselves, full of cryptic imagery and symbolic language, continued to invite multiple interpretations. The Sibyl was not a figure easily pinned down. She was always a question, a puzzle, a whisper from the shadowy borderlands of history and legend. It is fitting, then, that the Renaissance, an era of both illumination and ambiguity, would embrace her fully. The Sibyl stands at the crossroads of reason and faith, of art and prophecy, embodying the restless search for meaning that defines human experience. And as the centuries moved forward, her story did not end. In the modern age, artists, writers, and thinkers would continue to draw upon her legacy, weaving the Sibyl's voice into new stories and new dreams. But before we cross into that world, we must pause to reflect on the journey so far from ancient groves and imperial courts, through monastic halls and cathedral shadows, to the brilliant light of the Renaissance. The Sibyl's history is not just a tale of prophecy, but a story of transformation, resilience, and the enduring human desire to listen for voices beyond time. The world of the Sibyl stretches far beyond ancient temples, medieval monasteries, and Renaissance chapels. Her voice has echoed into modern times, transforming yet again, an eternal whisper reshaped by each era's hopes, fears, and dreams. In the age of science and reason, where prophecy might seem out of place, the Sibyl surprisingly finds new forms of life. Poets and writers turn to her as a symbol of mystery in an increasingly rational world. She becomes less a literal prophetess and more an emblem of the human longing to know what lies beyond the visible, to glimpse a deeper truth hidden beneath the surface of time. The Sibyl's verses inspire romantic poets like Shelley and Keats, whose imaginations soar amid ancient ruins and mythic echoes. To them, she is a muse not of strict prediction, but of poetic insight, a voice that bridges the mortal and the divine. The Sibyl embodies the tension between certainty and mystery that haunts the creative spirit. In the visual arts, modern painters and sculptors revisit her image, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with playful irony. She appears in surrealist compositions as a figure, both timeless and elusive, her scrolls replaced by fragmented texts, her gaze turned inward to an unseen future. The Sibyl, in this context, becomes a mirror reflecting our own quest to make sense of an uncertain world. Even in popular culture, films, novels, and music, the Sibyl's legacy lingers. She often appears as a symbol of fate's inevitability, or as a cryptic guide to characters navigating the labyrinth of their own stories. Her ancient role as a bearer of prophecy translates naturally into narratives exploring destiny, choice, and the unknown. In philosophy and cultural studies, the Sibyl raises questions about how we interpret the past and predict the future. What does it mean to speak of prophecy in an age dominated by data and statistics? Can the poetic and intuitive knowledge the Sibyl represents coexist with scientific understanding? These questions keep her alive in scholarly conversations, ensuring her story remains relevant. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of the Sibyl's modern presence is her invitation to listen, to quiet the mind, to open the heart, and to receive wisdom not only from words, but from silence. In a world that moves fast, where information overload clouds reflection, the Sibyl's gentle call encourages moments of pause, a space where mystery and meaning might meet. As we continue our journey, it is clear that the Sibyl is more than a historical figure. She is an enduring symbol of the human desire to touch the eternal, to hear the faint whispers that speak beyond our everyday lives. The chapters ahead will carry us further into the Sibyl's influence on modern storytelling and spiritual practice, revealing how this ancient voice still resonates in the quiet corners of our collective imagination. Though separated from their original context by centuries, the Sibylline Oracles remain surprisingly present in the world around us today. Their survival is a testament not only to the endurance of ancient texts, but also to the human fascination with prophecy, mystery, and the search for meaning across time. In some religious traditions, echoes of the Sibylline voice still resonate. Certain Christian communities, especially those interested in the intersections of biblical prophecy and classical antiquity, study the oracles to better understand how ancient peoples anticipated spiritual truths. The oracles are referenced in theological discussions about prophecies placed both inside and outside sacred scripture, offering a window into how faith communities have historically navigated the boundaries between accepted doctrine and outside influences. Scholars of classical literature and history continue to examine the Sibylline texts, not just as curiosities, but as crucial documents revealing how cultures interact and evolve. Their fragmented nature and composite origins make the oracles a fascinating puzzle, a layered narrative where pagan wisdom, Jewish theology, and early Christian thought intertwine. Modern critical editions and translations make these works accessible, inviting new generations to explore their enigmatic verses. Outside academia, the Sibyl's spirit appears in the ongoing popularity of prophecy in popular culture. Films, novels, and even video games draw on the archetype of the Sibyl, a mysterious seer whose visions shape destinies and warn of upheaval. These contemporary reinventions reflect a deep-rooted human need to imagine the future, to grasp the invisible threads guiding history's unfolding. In spiritual and New Age circles, the Sibyl is sometimes embraced as a symbol of ancient wisdom and feminine intuition. She represents a voice from the past that encourages introspection, a connection to nature's cycles, and respect for the mysteries that evade easy explanation. For many, the Sibyl embodies a timeless archetype, the guide through darkness who points toward light, the keeper of knowledge beyond the rational mind. Even in academic libraries and museums, the Sibylline Oracles inspire curiosity. Manuscripts preserved in quiet archives tell stories of scribes and scholars who, over millennia, painstakingly copied and preserved these fragile texts. Exhibitions that showcase illuminated manuscripts featuring the Sibyl bring history alive, reminding us that every page carries a lineage of human hands and hearts. What is remarkable is that the Sibyl's legacy is not frozen in the past. Instead, it breathes and shifts, reflecting the hopes and anxieties of each new age. Whether as prophetic scripture, artistic muse, or spiritual symbol, she continues to speak, albeit softly, to those willing to listen. As we approach the conclusion of this journey through the Sibylline Oracles, it is fitting to reflect on what this enduring story teaches us. That history is not just a record of facts, but a living conversation between past and present, seen and unseen, certainty and mystery. And now, as you lie in quiet, letting these ancient words and images settle like a gentle tide, you carry a piece of that conversation with you. As the night deepens and the world grows still, we come to the gentle closing of our journey through the history of the Sibylline Oracles. It has been a path winding through ancient forests, marble temples, quiet monasteries, and luminous cathedrals. A journey woven with voices that have crossed millennia to meet us here. The Sibyl, that mysterious prophetess clothed in the mist of legend and history, remains a figure both elusive and enduring. She is not merely a bearer of cryptic verses, but a symbol of the human spirit's endless quest to seek meaning beyond the obvious, to listen for the whispers of the future carried on the winds of time. In tracing her footsteps from the sacred groves of early Italy through the bustling streets of imperial Rome, the silent halls of monastic scribes, the soaring heights of Renaissance frescoes, and into the pages of modern imagination, we see how history itself is a living story. It is one shaped by voices preserved, transformed, and reinterpreted, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. Perhaps the greatest gift of the Sibylline Oracles is their invitation to embrace mystery. In a world often driven by certainty and speed, her words offer a pause, a space to dwell in the unknown, to find comfort in what cannot be fully understood. It is in this quiet mystery that dreams take root and restfulness begins. As you settle deeper into your sleep, imagine the Sibyl's voice as a soft echo, carrying the wisdom of ages just beyond reach, like the faraway murmur of leaves in a gentle breeze. Allow her ancient vision to soothe your mind, to guide you gently toward the calm horizons of your own dreams. Remember, the Sibyl was a guardian of secrets, a keeper of time's hidden patterns, and now her story becomes part of your own night's journey, a lullaby spun from the threads of history, prophecy, and quiet wonder. Thank you for joining me in this exploration, wherever you are, and whatever hour it is. May these words bring peace and a sense of timeless connection as you drift toward rest. Good night, and until we meet again.